Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the psychological aspects of what might seem at first to be a purely physical topic. How to start an exercise regimen that leads to physical fitness. But before getting into that, I thought it might be fun to try a little fitness experiment, which I'll put at the end of this video. So, today's question is, how many pull-ups in a row do you think a 58-year-old college professor can do? So, take a good look at me and my dad-bod and think about that question for a second. And by the way, feel free to put your best guess in the comments section, because at the end of this video, we'll go outside and find out exactly how many pull-ups in a row this 58-year-old college professor can do. So, what is the psychology of starting to exercise, especially if we've never been serious about it in the past? I'd say that the very first step involves a combination of two things. One of them has to do with the desire to be fit, and the other has to do with thinking of ourselves as capable of being fit, or at least fitter than we've been up to now. Let's look at the desire to be fit first, because that seems to be the more fundamental of the two. After all, if you can imagine yourself getting fit but don't really want to, it's probably not going to happen anyhow. But if you really want to but can't imagine yourself doing it, well, you're probably going to find a way of changing your thinking eventually. So, by wanting to be fit, what I mean is a very real, very intense, heartfelt desire for it. Maybe you've noticed that when we feel a deep yearning for something that's realistically attainable in our lives, there's actually very little that can stand in our way, at least not for very long. The implication, of course, is that what makes changing our lives so difficult is not the experience of change per se. It's the long process of moving from the realm of ruminating and fantasizing about change to the realm of taking concrete action. Basically, the hardest part about changing our lives is getting to the point where we really want to change. Up until that point, it's more like we're still just fantasizing about change. We don't really want it, even if we're constantly telling ourselves that we do. In other words, what we're doing up to that point is pretending to want to change. We're performing a kind of internal theater for ourselves, a kind of self-deceptive play acting where we tell ourselves that we really want to get fit, for instance. But what it actually means is that we're still just fantasizing about getting fit and trying to convince ourselves that it would be a good idea. But in reality, we're still not taking any concrete action yet, because our desire is still so weak that we're unable to move ourselves out of the realm of wishful thinking and fantasy and into the realm of action. Of course, at this point, the question naturally becomes, how can we start to move from a very dilute, attenuated desire for fitness to one that compels us to take definite action? And here I find that there are two basic sides to it. One of those sides has to do with what might beckon us toward getting in shape, and the other has to do with what might move us away from staying out of shape. Basically, a positive motivation and a negative one. Let's look at them one at a time. First, what might beckon us toward getting in shape? Of course, that's a very personal question whose answer probably varies a lot from person to person. So there's probably not a single definitive answer to that question, and it would be futile of me to try to give you one. Consequently, the point is to search for some personally compelling meaning for our fitness regimen, one that's strong enough to call us out of our lethargy, a kind of vision or goal that we want to attain, or at least move closer to. For example, probably the most common meaning that inspires young people has to do with enhancing their love life, and especially attracting sexual partners. Another has to do with taking pride in athletic achievements, setting new personal records, etc. For older people, like myself, it more commonly has to do with just wanting to feel a greater sense of well-being and to retain more youthful vitality. But the point is that without some sort of personally meaningful vision or goal, it's pretty hard to begin a challenging exercise regimen and to sustain it over the long haul. However, the other part of our desire for fitness has to do with what we're moving away from. A kind of negative motivation in a sense. Basically, that has to do with how we might be getting tired and fed up with being out of shape. And surprisingly, I find that one of the best paradigms for understanding how that happens comes from the psychology of addiction. But maybe that's not so surprising, because after all, complacently dwelling in our fantasies and comfort zones is itself a highly addictive habit. Anyhow, in the clinical treatment of addiction, either literal or figurative, there's the fairly common idea of needing to bottom out. What bottoming out means is that in order to get past all of the outright denial and feckless fantasies and excuse-making, addicts will often have to have some sort of truly horrific, excruciatingly painful life experience that brings them so low that the only way out is to start moving up. And it seems to me that that same basic logic often applies to the realm of fitness. Maybe bottoming out means that we need to hear our doctors telling us that we're well on the way to diabetes or a heart attack or an unnecessarily premature death. Or maybe we just need to become so thoroughly saturated with our own physical misery, so sick and tired of feeling, well, sick and tired, always struggling to catch our breath, always feeling weak and physically incapable. In any case, I find that in terms of a negative motivation, one of the best ways to move from fantasy to concrete action is to become acutely aware of the heavy price we pay for avoiding the issue of our physical fitness. So thoroughly, consciously aware of it that we start to bottom out and realize that the only way out is to start moving up, no matter how low we've managed to sink beforehand. At the same time, I find that it's helpful to realize that our best friend is actually the thing that helps us become more fully aware of our misery, and that our biggest enemy is everything that conceals it or disguises it or that helps us ignore it altogether. In other words, our real friend is what makes us more self-aware. The thing that helps us perceive our bodies and our experience more honestly and accurately, especially with an eye toward how we might make them better in the future. Okay, so that's a brief outline of some of the key features of the kind of desire that can move us from a fantasy relation to physical fitness to an action relation to it. But like I mentioned earlier, along with really wanting to change, it's also necessary to start thinking of ourselves differently. More specifically, we need to start thinking of ourselves as people who potentially can be fit, or at least fitter than we are, and who deserve to be fit, people for whom physical fitness is a very real and imminent possibility. In other words, we need to give up the nasty habit of thinking that we're somehow incapable and or undeserving of experiencing the joy of real physical fitness. In humanistic psychology, we sometimes call these thoughts limiting beliefs. Of course, sometimes our limiting beliefs actually are realistic. For instance, I have a limiting belief at this point in my life that it's highly unlikely that I'll ever be an NBA superstar, which I would say is pretty realistic. However, a lot of our limiting beliefs aren't like that. A lot of the time, they're little more than bad habits we've fallen into, and they end up diminishing our potential and governing our lives. But the good news is that they're also bad habits that we can actually give up if we can manage to summon enough courage to do so. And in my experience, that's usually the case in the realm of exercise and physical fitness. The fact is that except for people suffering from certain serious medical conditions, practically everyone can benefit from a physical fitness regimen. And it doesn't take some sort of extraordinary degree of knowledge or innate athletic talent to do it. But it does take a real heartfelt desire, as well as the belief that it's possible for us to move toward it. And as far as whether or not we deserve to be physically fit, I'd say that enjoying our physical bodies is part of pretty much everyone's basic human birthright, and that everyone deserves to feel the fulfillment that comes with making our bodies better little by little. So if you're someone who thinks that you somehow don't deserve to enjoy being physically fit, I'd say that you're just plain wrong about that. Okay, so step one involves really wanting to change, where we move from merely fantasizing about fitness to taking direct action, as well as starting to think of ourselves as people who are both capable of attaining fitness and deserving of it. Step two then involves letting go of whatever self-deceptive excuses are getting in our way. That may seem pretty obvious and straightforward, but for a lot of us it's actually far more tricky and subtle than that. The reason is that most of us are extremely good at lying to ourselves. A lot of the time we tell ourselves we believe or feel one thing, when the exact opposite of it is what's really true. For instance, it's easy to make a big deal out of buying new exercise shoes and clothes and maybe even a brand new exercise bike. But surprise! A month or two later, the exercise bike has somehow miraculously transformed itself into a $500 clothes rack for our almost new sweatsuits and sneakers. What happened to all of our grand plans? Well, in all probability, our desire simply wasn't strong enough to carry us through the inevitable discomfort of starting a serious exercise regimen, and so we concocted an admixture of semi-plausible excuses to disguise that unpleasant fact. In fact, I'd say that if there's one single thing that most commonly gets in the way of our fitness, it would be our excuses. And the reason why it's so easy to make excuses in the domain of physical fitness is that exercising is actually challenging and naturally involves some measure of discomfort. So, if we're thoroughly ruled by our desire to avoid discomfort, as many people are, we'll always be able to find at least one convincing excuse not to work out today. In other words, getting past our excuses almost always involves changing the way we relate to the sensation of physical discomfort and pain, especially so that we're no longer ruled by it and ultimately enslaved to it. Of course, changing our relation to physical discomfort may sound like a pretty tall order. But one way of getting started would be to ask ourselves a pretty simple question. What do we really want in our lives? Do we really want to feel fit, lean, and powerfully alive as we move from moment to moment and from year to year? Or, when it comes down to it, would we rather consistently take the path of least resistance and assiduously avoid feeling physically challenged or uncomfortable whenever possible? It's an interesting and a very personal question. But for a lot of people, not all, but a lot, the answer is that underneath all of our excuses and bad habits, we'd really rather prefer to be strong and bursting with aliveness. But we've somehow become addicted to complacently lounging around in our comfort zones instead, mostly because we haven't seriously confronted the terrifying question of what we really want in our lives and what we're willing to do to get it. Anyhow, since excuses constitute one of the greatest impediments to physical fitness, let's take a minute or two to explore some of the most common ones. First, there's the ever-popular, "I'm too busy," along with its variant, "I don't have time." Here, let me share a bit of wisdom that I wish I'd thought of, but which actually came from a colleague of mine, Jeff Reber. One day, we were all sitting around in a faculty meeting at the university, bemoaning the fact that we were all too busy to connect more often with each other as intellectual colleagues. And Jeff Reber said, rather matter-of-factly, "You know, I'm too busy actually means I have other priorities." And it struck me like a bolt of lightning. I'm too busy actually means I have other priorities. Wow. And personally, I've been able to apply that basic insight in my own life. For instance, I've discovered that even when I'm pretty busy, there's really nothing stopping me from waking up at 4:30 and immediately hitting the gym, which is actually what my wife and I usually do a couple times a week these days. Yeah, it doesn't feel particularly comfortable to be working out in what feels like the middle of the night. But then again, getting in good shape isn't really about taking the path of least resistance, is it? course, when I tell my students about how my wife and I do that, they're usually dumbfounded, as if she and I were accomplishing some sort of astounding, godlike feat. But it's not really that at all. It's just a matter of deciding that fitness is a worthwhile priority and then straightforwardly doing what needs to be done. It's really no big deal once you know what you want and are willing to reorder your priorities to get it. Okay, second excuse. I just don't feel like it. Whose most common variants are probably, I'm too tired, and it's too boring. Here I'd say that in a way, I just don't feel like it is a more fundamental and forthright excuse than I'm too busy is. In fact, most of the time, I'm too busy is really little more than a disguise for, I just don't feel like it. And at this point, it's important to say that making fitness a priority in our lives inevitably involves doing things that we don't necessarily feel like doing. The reality of fitness is that not every workout is an ecstatic peak experience. Sure, some of them are, but the fact is that a lot of them aren't. In fact, sometimes it's all my wife and I can do to drag our sorry asses through a workout, especially when it's dark 30 in the morning, as she sometimes calls it. These are the harrowing times that we call maintenance workouts, and there are a lot of them strewn along the road of physical fitness. Maybe we're just dog-ass tired. Maybe the weather's too hot or too cold. But we both know that all of that's just life's way of getting us to dig deep in order not to be enslaved by our I just don't feel like it impulses. That's when we find out how much courage we really have. And we found through the years that half the trick in those moments is to realize that the excuse of I just don't feel like it isn't actually our friend. It may seem like it is on the surface, but in reality, it isn't building us up and it isn't helping us get what we really want in our lives. Yeah, it may feel pretty good in the short term, but in the long run, it's only making us weaker and less fulfilled. Okay, probably the third most common excuse is something like, I need X before I start. For instance, I need someone to show me what to do first, or I need to buy X, Y, and Z or join a gym first. But in reality, all of that's probably not even close to being true. For instance, consider all of the simple, zero-cost, zero-equipment exercises they taught us in elementary schools. Things like sit-ups, push-ups, burpees, sometimes also known as squat thrusts, pull-ups, dips, crunches, even just walking or jogging for a while. Yeah, it's easy to underrate those kinds of things because they can seem too simple and too amateurish, but they're actually really great exercises whether you're a complete beginner or a seasoned veteran. So, odds are that you do know a lot about how to get started. Just try doing a single set of each of those exercises that may be 2/3 of your max, and then see how your body feels over the next 2 days. Then increase or decrease the amount accordingly every other day. Or if you're still not confident of yourself, try watching a few YouTube videos for additional pointers, which you can actually do right now and at no cost. And you don't really need a gym or a lot of bulky, expensive gear to get started either, because you can do those basic exercises practically anywhere. And the kicker is that you can actually get a pretty decent workout from them. Probably not an advanced workout, true, but still a pretty decent basic one. In fact, when I personally can't get to the gym, I have an abbreviated home routine that consists mostly of those basic elementary school exercises. Sometimes I'll do them in my office before work. I'll put 2 chairs together and do dips between them when no one's looking. I'll do curls with my suitcase if I'm on the road. I'll do pull-ups in doorways or stairwells or even on tree branches when I have to. Basically, where there's a will, there's a way. And it doesn't really matter if other people laugh at you or don't get it. After all, it's your fitness and your life that's at stake, not theirs. But once again, the main point is to stop living a life of excuses and start living a life of determination and decisive action. Okay, so In my view, those are three of the most common kinds of excuses that I find get in the way of physical fitness. I'm too busy, I just don't feel like it, and I need X first. Of course, there are many others that we can use to justify staying out of shape. That's because making excuses is a very common thing in the world of human affairs, whether it's in the domain of exercise or elsewhere. However, the deeper psychological reason why excuses are so prevalent in our world is that relatively few of us are willing to assume real responsibility for the quality of our lives, physically or otherwise. As a consequence, very few of us are willing to take committed, decisive action to improve ourselves. And in turn, that's true mostly because a lot of us aren't willing to do what it takes to be genuinely free in this world. The unsettling reality is that most of us are content simply to remain slaves, and especially slaves to the kind of trivial, petty desires that play out along the most superficial levels of our being. In other words, although it can be difficult to admit, when it comes down to it, most of us actually have a very ambivalent relation to our freedom. Of course, on one hand, everyone wants to be free, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. But at the same time, most of us will actually fight tooth and nail against it. Basically, we want the options and joys that come along with being free, but a lot of the time we just aren't willing to pay the cost that genuine freedom entails. And the inevitable cost of real freedom is always a very personal form of responsibility. A responsibility for enhancing the quality of our own lives as well as the lives of the people around us. And starting a physical fitness regimen involves both sides of that dynamic, both freedom and responsibility. In other words, getting in shape involves laying claim to a range of freedom and a range of responsibility that lies far beyond the excuses we usually make for ourselves and far beyond our self-imposed enslavement to our own comfort. And so the real question underneath the decision to start an exercise regimen is, how free and how responsible, and consequently, how strong do we really want to be in this life? And what changes and what sacrifices are we willing to make to reach it? At the end of the day, starting a fitness regimen, especially for the very first time, is about undergoing a revolution in our thinking, our priorities, and our values. It's about changing the very substance of our lives, who we are and what we think we're capable of, and in the process, changing our experience of existence itself. Consequently, I would say that the real reason to get in shape, the real meaning behind it, isn't just to look better or even to feel better or even to get laid more often. It's really about becoming a particular kind of person. The kind of people who have liberated ourselves from the tyranny of our excuses and who are living out the deepest possible kind of freedom, the deepest possible kind of responsibility, and the deepest possible kind of meaningful engagement with life. That's the real reason to get in shape. The rest, well, the rest is just window dressing. Okay, with that in mind, let's go outside and see how many pull-ups a 58-year-old college professor can do. As always, thanks for watching. Stay fit and take care of your soul. Peace out. Okay, so here we are outside, and this will be an experiment in Dad-bod, because the question is, how many pull-ups in a row do you think a 58-year-old college professor can do? So let's get to it. Righty. Okay, so there's your answer. The answer is 18. Is that what you guessed? Well, the reason why I did this is because the thing is, the internet is full of all kinds of liars and all kinds of exaggerators. So I wanted to give you some kind of indication that what I'm saying here in this video actually holds water. Okay, have a good one. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.